The Boogeyman. It's a wives' tale used to scare little shits into behaving, because if they don't, a monster will come for them. But what if I told you the Boogeyman is actually real? This one didn't haunt children, he haunted a nation. His very name struck fear into the hardest of men. Armies would break and flee at the mere whisper that he was after them. Mothers warned their children to behave or he would get them. One such mother, while comforting her child, hushed these very words, "Hush, bairn, hush, he shall not get thee." But as she spoke, a hand touched her shoulder and a voice whispered in her ear, "I wouldn't be so sure." James of Douglas, or as his victims knew him, the Black Douglas, the hammerer of the English. We don't know his exact date of birth or where he was born, but most likely it was Douglas Castle in 1286. But this is common for the time. Unless you were a high lord or a king, you weren't going to be really recorded in history of where you were born or the date, obviously, because back then records weren't kept. It wasn't the same as nowadays with like hospital records, birth certificates. James was the eldest son of William Douglas, or he was also known as Larder, because for some reason every Douglas has a cool nickname. For example, Archibald Douglas the Grim. James's mother was Elizabeth, who was sister to James the High Steward of Scotland. Now, I'm going to give you some context of the actual First War of Scottish Independence, because it wouldn't make sense to jump straight in, because it won't. At cliffs near Kinghorn in Fife, Alexander III, King of Scots, was fatally thrown from his horse because he wanted pussy. This was the catalyst for King Edward I's attempt to conquer Scotland. The throne should have gone to Margaret, the Maid of Norway, who was Alexander's granddaughter, but she died of illness at Orkney. With this unfortunate set of events, Scotland was looking like it would evolve into a full-blown civil war, with lords everywhere, like the Commons, the Bruces. Literally, it was going to go to shit. So with this chaos, Bishop Fraser of St Andrews had the mega, super, intelligent, big brain idea of asking Edward I for help. In this video, I'll be calling Edward I Longshanks because there's 3 of them, and there's actually 4 Edwards in this video, so I'm trying to make it as easy as possible for you. Longshanks was chosen because who better to pick a king than a king? Although this sounds really stupid, it's important to remember that hindsight is a bitch. And during these times, England and Scotland weren't really bitter rivals. They were relatively friendly nations to each other, apart from a few odd wars and border skirmishes. Most of the actual untrust between England and Scotland dates back to this war because of Longshanks' what he did. And also he was brother-in-law to the dead king. After weeding down the contenders, there were only really 2 left. John Balliol and Robert Bruce. Not the one you're thinking of, but his grandfather. Both men were close relatives of the royal bloodline. Longshanks chose Balliol, who had, to be fair, the better claim, and he ruled from 1292 to 1296. But ruled is a strong word. He was more or less a puppet, and he gained the nickname Tomb Tabard, which basically means empty coat. Edward was hell-bent on embarrassing and undermining the Scottish king at every chance he got. Balliol, under pressure from the Scottish nobles, went into a mutual aid alliance with France, which became known as the Auld Alliance, which was made to counter English aggression. This pissed off Edward because he seen Scotland as his bitch, and this act of defiance by going to his rivals shattered his ego a bit. So Edward, in response, gathered his army and went off to teach the Scots a lesson, beginning the First War of Scottish Independence. And to speed past a lot of bullshit and unimportant wars and battles and shit, the Scottish army were defeated and Balliol was taken to the Tower of London, and the English now occupied Scotland. When Wallace's rebellion began in May 1297 after killing the English sheriff of Lanark, Heselrigg, he also went to raid Scone to try and kill William Ormsby, who was the Bitesize, I can't say that word, of Scotland. James's father joined Wallace on this raid because the Douglases loved the smoke. William Douglas was one of the only nobles to support Wallace in his early days. Ormsby barely escaped the attack by jumping out the window once the Scottish barred through his door. You've got to rate it. William Douglas had left a reputation of being reckless and just flat out insane. After his wife and James' mother died, he felt a bit lonely. And this was before Tinder, so he couldn't, meet someone like a sane person. So he kidnapped and forcibly married an English noblewoman who was also a widow. So, it's okay in the eyes of the law. But since she was of high ranking, Longshanks eventually heard of this, and he began to hate the name Douglas, foreshadowing. And also because Douglas was also doing a lot of other annoying shit like executing people without consulting the authorities, which might annoy some soy boy fucking congressman, but he's based. But what is also surprising about Wallace's rebellion is that the 22-year-old Robert the Bruce also joined him in this fight. And this is strange because he was the favourite of Longshanks. And the Chronicle of Guisborough states that he joined the Scots because he was Scottish. Based. So Bruce joined the rebellion, but he needed an excuse to raise his men without raising suspicion. So he was glad to know that he was picked to put down a rebellion at Douglas Castle. So when he reached Douglasdale, he switched sides and escorted the occupants of the castle to safety. Among them was most likely young James Douglas, around 11 years old. This would have been the first meeting of two legends. On the 11th of September, the Battle of Stirling Bridge took place, and under the Scots, Wallace and Andrew Moray beat a larger and superior English army as it tried to cross the River Forth. Unfortunately, Moray had been fatally injured and died sometime later in that year. Then, after raiding England, Wallace and his army clashed with the English at Falkirk, and the English won. At some point throughout the rebellion, James's father had been captured by the English and was sent south in chains and was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and James was sent to Paris by his family to prevent him from being also captured. James spent around 3 years in Paris, and Barbour tells us that he lived simply and sometimes in ribald company, and that he learned much of the life of a Parisian, like eating frogs. So basically he just kind of went for a uni party for 3 years in Paris, like the true Scotsman he was. But on one fateful day, a messenger came looking for him, bearing news his father was dead. We are told that William died by being murdered by the English while a prisoner in chains. This basically means he was killed in prison by an English soldier, but not formally executed. James swore right there and then that he would do all in his power to recover all that had been his father's, and that he would dedicate his life to reclaim his birthright. He travelled back to Scotland and contacted Bishop Lamberton of St Andrews in Fife, and was given the job of waiting on him at the table. Lamberton was a staunch patriot of the Scottish cause. He also had the ear of the English officials, but we do know that he entered a secret bond with Robert the Bruce to push his claim as future King of Scotland. When Longshanks came north in 1304, he held an assembly at Stirling, and Lamberton saw this as an opportunity to get James into a situation to get his lands back. And for some context, James was 18 at this time. Lamberton led James into an audience with Longshanks, and Lamberton basically said, this man's father died in the war and he wants his lands because it's inheritance. And Longshanks then asked him, who was your father? And when he learned that his father was the hated William Douglas, Longshanks rose from his chair and was pissed. He seemed more preoccupied with the fact that James's father had been an ally of Wallace, and not about the actual son. And Longshanks told Lamberton that he was the true heir of Douglas's land because he rebelled against him. And being a smart man, Lamberton rushed James out of the king's presence because Longshanks was not to be fucked with. After being dismissed by Longshanks, James was more determined than ever to get his land back. And about 2 years later, while staying with Lamberton, a news had reached him about something big happening in Dumfries. Robert the Bruce and John Colm had met up in Greyfriars Monastery on the 10th of February 1306. Some bickering turned into the unthinkable, and Bruce had stabbed Colm in the church. Bruce wasn't a fool and knew that this sacrilege would be conveyed to the Pope and he would be excommunicated. This would mean that he'd be unable to be the King of Scotland due to religious restrictions. So he had to haul ass to Scone, or Scone, I'm calling it fucking Scone, to get him crowned before his excommunication was put into effect. As the story was told to Lamberton, James knew that this was his chance, and he told Lamberton that he was going to go join Bruce, and Lamberton gave him his blessing and some money. But he also knew that James couldn't just leave because it would look bad on Lamberton. So the plan was that he would sneak into the stables during the night and steal a horse called Ferrand and to escape St Andrews. Yes, we know the name of the horse, don't ask me why. And James carried out this plan successfully and broke into the stables and stole the horse and escaped. Also, to add more realism, the groom wasn't told of the plan and he was battered by James because he tried to stop him. Bruce and his retinue had made their way north towards Scone through Annandale, and after passing the town of Moffat, the cavalcade made its way towards Devil's Beef Tub, which is a real place in Scotland. An old Roman road rose over the side of the Beef Tub, crossing the hills to Clydesdale, but as soon as they started to climb, they saw a group of men on horseback waiting for them. It was James. As Bruce drew up, James dismounted and knelt before him. He swore to be his man and gave him fealty. Bruce arrived at Scone and was crowned on the Moot Hill of Friday the 25th of March 1306. James would have been just one of the onlookers in the crowd, and as the crown was lowered on Bruce's head, the future has been sealed and Scotland was at war again. On the 5th of April 1306, Longshanks appointed Amel de Valence as a lieutenant in Scotland. He gave him power to raise the dragon, which basically meant that he was to show no chivalry, no mercy, no nothing to the Scots. Not even telling the truth. He could lie and, it'd be fine in terms of, warfare, which was a big thing back then. Like, these were their... Chivalry was what basically the Geneva Convention back then. I also feel like it's important to mention that Amel de Valence was the brother-in-law to John Comyn, so he wanted the smoke. He also had Lamberton arrested and sent to England. De Valence took up quarters in the walled city of Perth, and on the 18th of June 1306, Bruce appeared before the city walls with a small army and challenged Valence to surrender the city, or to come out and fight. Valence, being the solitude he was, declined because it was a Sunday, and that he would fight him the next day. Bruce took him at his word and withdrew to nearby Methven Castle. So Bruce's army were resting, cooking and settling down, and even some were sleeping, when Valence suddenly attacked. Some Scots did manage to organise a resistance, but most didn't have their armour or most weapons, so most were cut down and slaughtered, which quickly led to a rout. Bruce had barely managed to escape the battle as he was dehorsed multiple times. At the end of the battle, 16 Scottish knights and Thomas Randolph, who was Bruce's nephew, was captured. The 16 knights were executed at Newcastle later that year. James, like Bruce, barely escaped the battle, and the fragments of the army regrouped and headed east. This battle, even though it was a heavy defeat, changed Bruce. He tried to be chivalrous and was spat on for his troubles, so he knew it was time to take up a new tactic and fighting style. James also learned the same lesson as the king, and in modern terms, they locked in. Bruce and the remnants of his army headed west, with James among them, but it wasn't long until Bruce's enemies discovered where they were. James MacDougall of Lorne, who was cousin of the murdered Comyn, because for some reason everyone's related to Comyn, suddenly ambushed Bruce's army with around 1,000 men sent to Tyndrum. Bruce, after the battering at Methven, only had about 500 men, and even at that, a lot of his retinue were women and children and his wife. During the battle, the Bruce loyalists had to fight a rearguard action to escape the battle alive, and James also, in this fight, was wounded in battle. During the fighting, Bruce barely escaped again, as 3 MacDougalls surrounded him and had cut him off from support, but Bruce lived through the smoke, and the 3 MacDougalls quickly lay dead. Tradition states that Bruce and his men retreated to a nearby castle on the Isle of Lochdochart. Barbour tells us that during this time, James started to stand out a little. He had a flair for hunting and was one of the best hunters within the retinue. It was also around this time that Bruce realised the danger that he and his group were actually in, so he made the decision to send his wife, daughter and the woman to Kildrummy, who were to be escorted by Nigel Bruce, who was his brother. The castle was strong and had a lot of provisions, but a traitor had set a fire in the stables and they were forced to flee and headed north, most likely for Orkney or Norway, but they were betrayed again at St Duckhart Chapel in Rossshire. Nigel was drawn, hung and beheaded. Back in these days, women were also treated really well who were prisoners, better than men at least, but Longshanks had put the women in iron cages and hanged them in cages in the air for everyone to see. Bruce's wife, the Queen, was confined in a manor house at Burstwick, and his 12-year-old daughter was kept in a cage in London. Meanwhile, Bruce, who didn't know this had happened, headed southwest to Kintyre. By now, he had a force of roughly 200 men. They travelled down Glenfalloch, and due to the proximity to the English and his rivals, they made their way down the eastern side of Loch Lomond. One of Bruce's lieutenants was sent back to his lands to gather men and organise ships. Bruce worried about his men, as they had to lie in open hillsides during long nights, and some were unable to sleep. The year was passing, and it was getting colder. James didn't seem to have much problem with sleeping in the rough and out in the open, but the enemies of Bruce had made sure that there were no boats left that could be used to cross the loch shores. But James had found one. It was a sunken rowboat that could only fit 3 people. The first trip included Bruce, James, and the oarsman, and they were dropped off on the west shore and then went back for others. Barbour tells us that it took a day and a night of constant rowing to bring everyone across the loch. Some of the men opted to even swim in the water, holding onto the boat. After all the men were across, they were in a dire need of food, and Bruce made 2 foraging groups, one being led by himself, and the other led by James. While out foraging, they stumbled across Malcolm, Earl of Lennox, who was overjoyed to meet the King of Scots, and led them to the Firth of Clyde, where he then encountered Neil Campbell, who was the lieutenant sent to gather men in boats, and he had kept his word. They set sail, keeping near as shore as possible to the Isle of Bute, and this was to make it harder to be spotted. For some reason, Malcolm's galley fell behind the rest of the fleet, and traitors from Bute tried to overtake the ship, but Malcolm dumped his gear overboard, and the traitors stopped to take that instead. Bruce, James, and the rest of his men were given hospitality by Angus Og, Lord of the Isles at Dunaverty. Bruce's party stayed at Dunaverty for 3 days, then they made their way to the island of Rathlin, just off the Irish coast. With the strong English fleet in the area, Rathlin would have been easily attacked, so it's best to assume they didn't stay long. James was beginning to fret as winter wore on. He felt that the weather and cold shouldn't stop them from battering the English, so he went to one of Bruce's captains, Robert Boyd. He suggested that he could take some men and attack Broderick Castle on the Isle of Arran. Boyd agreed, since he knew Arran well. They then approached Bruce and asked to be allowed to carry out this plan, and Bruce agreed. They got together a small force and rode over to Arran from Kintyre, landing in the middle of the night. They hid the boat and crept up to the castle before it came day. The Englishman in charge of Broderick was Sir John Hastings. James heard that the Hastings often rode out with his followers on forays around the island or raids, so they sent an ambush out for him. But as they sat waiting, 3 English ships appeared full of provisions, clothing and arms for the castle garrison. A body of men, and the men started to unload the boats, and as they strolled past the hidden Scots, carrying barrels full of wine and gear, James and his men promptly broke cover and attacked them boldly. They killed around 40 men, and the screams and commotions alerted the castle, which led the garrison to rush out of the castle to advance towards the Scots. But they weren't expecting soldiers, they were expecting civilians and locals who weren't really well armed or skillful. With this, the English ran back to the castle, with the Scots cutting down the stragglers, but they managed to bar the gates shut before the Scots could get in the castle. When the Scots focused their attention to the ships, they noticed that the crews had withdrew their ships, but a strong wind was against them, and they couldn't pass the breakers to get to open sea. They were trapped, unable to land, unable to escape. Eventually, 2 ships took in too much water and capsized, and the Scots gathered what they could and made their way to a nice defensible spot. Happy with the free loot they had just stolen, James and Robert Boyd remained there for 10 days. Meanwhile, Bruce had arrived at Arran with 33 galleys and made inquiries to find James. Bruce made his way to Glencloy and blew a blast on his horn. James and Boyd recognised this, and they regrouped with each other. Bruce's mother was the Countess of Carrick, and he was most likely born at Carrick's main stronghold, Turnberry Castle. Longshanks had taken Turnberry and gave it to Henry Percy, who lorded it with 300 men, so Bruce focused his attention to start recovering mainland Scotland by capturing his homeland. Bruce and his men, Bruce had a man from Carrick with him on Arden, and he was called Cuthbert, which is a horrible name. Cuthbert travelled to Carrick by stealth and started to spy to figure out the weaknesses and how many locals felt about uprising. Then he would set a fire nearby Turnberry Point, which would alert Bruce and his men to arrive and attack. Bruce explained to James that he had 2 of his brothers with some Irish chieftains and a large body of men near Kintyre to make a second landing near Galloway to make a two-pronged attack. Several nights later, a fire was seen in the darkness. Bruce, seeing this, quickly launched the galleys and began the attack. At the beach, they saw a distressed and panicking Cuthbert. Cuthbert explained that the land was full of English soldiers and that the people were treated horribly, but they were not ready to join Bruce. And also that the fire wasn't even lit by Cuthbert. A fire had started in a fisherman's hut, and seeing this, he quickly ran towards it, knowing the army would come. This put Bruce and his captains in a difficult situation, so Bruce asked his men what they think he should do. Sir Edward Bruce, Bruce's brother, said that he should take their chances and attack anyway rather than later on and go back to Arran because he couldn't be arsed. Based. Cuthbert, with this, said around 200 of the English were quartered in the village and the rest were in the castle. Bruce, seeing the chance for a devious ambush, launched the attack. They crept towards the village, and when the time was right, they kicked in the doors of the houses and killed the English while they slept and scrambled for weapons, and James played this part well. The ferocious attack alerted the men in the castle, but they refused to leave out of fear, so they barred the gates. While there, a kinswoman of Bruce, Christina of Carrick, informed Bruce what had happened at the castle, and what happened to his brother and daughter and family. But bad news kept coming. When the landings happened, the men were attacked by an overwhelming army. Thomas and Alexander and an Irish king called Malcolm MacQuillan and Sir Reginald Crawford had been captured. Then they were taken to Carlisle and were hanged and beheaded. After the successful battle, James went to Bruce and asked him if he could take some men to Douglas, and Bruce let him go. James and his two companions secretly made their way to Douglasdale, and he kept away from the more populated areas in the village, to his father's old friend's house, who was called Thomas Dixon. He had helped his father and Wallace capture the castle at Sanquhar, or however you say it, and acted as a messenger between them. Then who better to be a trusted ally of the rebellion, other than an old rebel? When James explained who he was, Thomas Dixon was delighted to see the young boy he knew come back to his homeland, and after quickly taking an oath of loyalty, both men made a plan to attack Douglasdale, and it was 3 days of Palm Sunday, and the garrison would be attending a service at St Bride's along with the locals. James went to the service, disguised as a farm worker. The English soldiers appeared from the castle, and they were all carrying a palm leaf. The around 30 soldiers crowded into the small church and had left their weapons outside of the church because it was heavily frowned upon, and I think foreshadowing. The locals also crammed themselves into the church, having hidden a weapon on each of them. The plan was, when everyone was ready, James would give the signal and everyone would boogaloo. But for some reason, James gave the signal early, and before everyone was prepared, he shouted his famous slogan, "Douglas, Douglas." Barbour tells us that upon hearing the signal, Thomas threw himself into the nearest Englishman and managed to kill 2 or 3, but was ran through and killed. This is at odds with the fact that Bruce granted Thomas lands of Symington in Lanarkshire for his services, but obviously this could have been a son. After seeing Thomas's death, grain of salt with that one, James pushed even harder and more ferocity, which led the locals to also get involved, and after the slaughter, 20 soldiers were killed and 10 were captured. James then sent a group of Scots to rush the castle, but when they got there, there were only a cook and a porter inside, and they had prepared a large meal for the Englishmen. But since they were all dead and not needing the meal, James invited the locals and they all ate the banquet. After the nice meal, all of the moving goods were seized and everything was to be destroyed to make it unusable for the English. All the provisions like wheat, flour, malt were brought down to the cellar and were scattered on the floor. James then brought down the 10 prisoners and beheaded all of them. And then he burst the wine barrels on top of the bodies and set the place on fire. Also, to seal the deal, he dumped the bodies of horses and salt into the well to poison the water to make the area unusable. One of James's spies brought him news of a large body of the English troops, said to number around 1,000 men, advancing south through Cunningham towards Kyle in Ayrshire. James had 60 men at most, so there was no point of thinking about even attacking the English. Yeah, he did it anyway. He knew the English needed to advance down a route called Mackwornock. This route crossed marshland and was a very narrow place to go on as well, so it was perfect for an ambush. The Scots laid an ambush all night, and the next day they caught a glimpse of the glare of the armour and weapons of the English, and as soon as the English advance ranks were in view of the Scots, the rest of the English army were in tight ranks. As the army crossed the ford, James and his men rushed at them and forced many into water. Other Scots in the bushes and tall grasses fired arrows into the ranks of the English, causing a massive confusion, and the English tried to retreat, but they couldn't go forward, left or right due to marshy terrain. They could only go backwards, but the English at the back didn't know what was happening, so they were still pushing forward, causing the ranks to panic. The leader of the army, Sir Philip Mowbray, forced his horse forward, cutting his way through the Scots. One Scot tried to pull him from his horse by grabbing his belt, but luckily for Mowbray, his belt snapped and he managed to escape the fight. And after the fighting, 60 English lay dead, with the rest retreating to Bothwell Castle. It is also around this time that Barbour tells us that James had met up with Robert the Bruce and Edward Bruce. They were told by Robert he had been attacked by the English troops that were under the command of Aymer de Valence, but had managed to escape the fight alive. The whereabouts of Valence camp was still unknown. However, James had seen an English camp while on his way to this very meeting, and also that the English would be easier to attack since they seemed unprepared for a sudden attack and were scattered about. Around 140 Scots made their way to the English camp and found that the English were around 200 strong in a local village. There was no holding back. They stormed every house, killing every Englishman they could find. Then they disappeared into the darkness, into the dawn. Valence was helpless in this face of guerrilla warfare, no matter how large or equipped his army actually was. At the start of May 1307, he discovered that Bruce's army of around 600 men, which included James, were encamped at Galstone in the Loudoun Valley in Ayrshire. Valence issued a challenge to Bruce by saying, "Stop camping, you little bitch, and fight me like a man." Obviously, I'm paraphrasing, but it does show the arrogance of the English, asking Bruce for a fair fight after lying to Bruce at Methven. But Bruce wasn't a bitch, unlike Valence, and did not lie, and he said, "Meet me, bro, at Loudon Hill on the 10th of May. Now, if you've seen Loudon Hill, you'll know it's massive. The biggest parts are 1,000 feet high, and easily the most defensive spot in all of south of Scotland. Bruce, being Bruce, did not pick that spot. He went, big hill, let's fight at the bottom of it. Bruce was a genius at making small numbers mean nothing by utilising the terrain. Bruce had been to the low ground of Loudon Hill a few days earlier to inspect the ground and find an ideal spot. He noted that the road from Darville to Straven ran under the flanks of the hill. On the wide, firm ground that started to narrow with a bog encroaching on either side, Bruce saw his chances and had his men dig 3 rows of ditches across the narrowing ground, and Barbour says a bow shot apart. These ditches were to stop or slow down heavy cavalry to avoid them, to gather enough speed to smash through the Scottish position. Ditches also didn't need to be that deep or wide to stop them, since horses who were wearing heavy armour couldn't jump due to the weight. And on the morning of the 10th of May, Bruce marched his 600 men forward into 2 divisions. They set themselves up at the chosen spot, their spear points outstretched. The 3,000 English appeared from the direction of Darville, and when they saw the Scots lined up front, they began charging their heavy horses at the Scots. To the English, this must have been an easy win. Then they hit the first ditches, and the slaughter began. Some Englishmen were thrown from their horses and smashed to the ground, but then the cavalry regrouped. But then they hit the second ditch, then the third, and by then, confusion and disarray had taken hold of the group. It was chaos. The Scots held firm, making kebabs into any horses or men that happened to ram into them. Then the Scots started to push forward, and the English fell backwards. Panic spread throughout the ranks, and a lot of men decided the day was lost and began to retreat from the battle. And the Scots charged at the retreating English, cutting down any stragglers. The story of Loudoun Hill would spread like wildfire over Scotland, causing men to flock to Bruce. James had sent spies all around Douglasdale, and now the spies are bringing back information about the English. They had sent workmen to Douglasdale and began rebuilding the area. It probably wasn't fun for the workers because they had to clean out all the dead shit that James left behind. The new troops were under the command of a man named Furwall, and when James arrived at Douglas, he asked the locals about Furwall, and James pulled a few stunts to figure out how he would respond. Furwall made raids in the surrounding countryside, so James decided to take advantage of this. He gathered up some locals and he based himself at Sandyland, 6 miles down the stream of the Douglas Water. At dawn the next day, James sent a few men to the land surrounding the castle to round up any cattle that was there, and where Furwall was informed about this, he rallied his men and set off in pursuit. The castle rustlers were far ahead by this point, and the English didn't chase them in any proper order. As the pursuit went on, they began to tire and slow, and when the rustlers had baited the English past James's position, he sprung the trap and charged out. Furwall was killed in the ambush, and his men were also cut down, with only a few of them managing to escape back to the castle. The English in the castle who saw this, in a panic, dropped their gates early, and a lot of their own men outside the castle gates were trapped. Then, on the 7th of July, 1307, Longshanks died while trying to lead his last invasion into Scotland. He took his last breath, being able to see Scotland, but not standing on its soil. The new king was King Edward II, which will be referred to as such in this video. And with Longshanks now dead, this was the perfect time for Bruce to consolidate his position in the northeast of Scotland. James was left in the south of Scotland to wreak havoc against the occupying English there. James was now growing in stature in the eyes of Bruce and Scotland, as he was left in charge of the south at only 21 years old. We have little snippets of his movements. We hear him in the forest around Paisley in September. He had managed to break the English hold in that area around Douglasdale, although the castle was still against him. After the killing of Furwall, the new governor was son John Webton, and he would soon deal with this man. Before that, he carried out raids into the Selkirk region. Selkirk stood in the heart of its own forest and was part of the ever greater Ettrick Forest. The English could only control the forest superficially, since they could be easily attacked from the forest and were unable to counterattack no matter how many garrisons they had. So it's understandable why James wanted to control it, so he could just use it as a base of operations and do as much damage as possible. He also cleared the English from Jed Forest. All of the forests of the borderland were connected and was known back then to the Scots as the Forest, although now they're all no longer connected. But the time came when he felt secure enough. He returned to Douglas to deal with Webton. James, like Bruce, wouldn't risk a single Scottish life unless it was necessary, and this is what Scotland needed, as Scotland was outnumbered 10-1 by the English population. When James got back to Douglas, he employed the same tactic on Furwall. He had 14 men load sacks of hay on horses and took them by the castle in full view of those battlements. Basically, that meme that I'll play right now, that's what happened with the English. It would have been easy pickings to just take the Scots stuff. So Webton moved his men and went to take the Scottish people's stuff. But then the Scots went past James's position and they threw the sacks of hay off the horses and drew their weapons. This startled Webton's men because they thought they were locals and not armed soldiers. But this confusement and astonishment, both equally, turned into fear. They realised behind them that James and his men had left their cover and engaged the English from behind. They were encircled. No Englishman survived the ambush, and Webton was cut down. James with his men quickly turned and charged the castle and managed to get past the gates, and the castle fell. But unlike in previous engagements, James let the surviving garrison leave to go back home to England. As the Scots looted the castle, they discovered a letter for Webton from a lady, and it was roughly said that if he was ever to be a true lover, then he should kill James in battle. Webton died for pussy. There you go, gentlemen. Women are the problem of everything. I'm joking. To stop this re-garrisoning of the castle, he just destroyed the whole thing. Bruce had consolidated his power in the north. Bruce's now only surviving brother, Sir Edward, fought to consolidate Galloway. He was a very skilled cavalry commander, but he lacked the king's judgment and was known to be rash and reckless. This is quite important foreshadowing for one of the biggest battles ever in Scottish history. And he also deserves a video in himself, with the King of Ireland and stuff, but maybe for another day. James concentrated on his own sphere of operations with royal consent. He had control of Douglasdale, much of the forest, and was making inroads into Lothian and the eastern borders. During his raids, James would end up in random places unannounced. On one occasion, as it was becoming night, he decided that his men should bunk at Hatfrew near Peebles. As James and his men approached, they heard voices within the building, and James crept closer. But when James got close, he recognised a voice. At his signal, his men drew their weapons and encircled the building. Those inside at some point became aware of the Scots' presence and tried to grab their weapons, but the Scots charged in and quickly wiped out the defenders. One of the prisoners of the English were immediately recognised by James. It was Thomas Randolph, the nephew of the king, who was captured at Methven. Randolph had agreed to fight for the English after his capture, which isn't unusual for the day. Sometimes the prisoners agreed to fight as a form of ransom, or just because they wanted to fight for the stronger side, like a bitch. James took Randolph to Bruce, and the king was very pleased with his fine catch, but Randolph wasn't sharing the same feelings. The English had done a CIA psyop on him and had brainwashed him into a staunch English larper. They had told him that Bruce was a mere rebel pretending to be a king, and the real king was Longshanks, rest in peace. They had actually given him the nickname King Hob, which means King Bobby, whatever that means. Bruce had power to order his death, but instead chose to take him under his wing and set his mind right, and eventually he did. Bruce had to continue the war, not only against the English, but the Scots that opposed him, and there were plenty. One such Scot was John of Lorne, who was located at Dunstafnage Castle in the Western Highlands, with Barbour telling us that he had a force of 2,000 men. The Royal Army most likely travelled around the head of the Loch Awe, and this would lead to a place called the Pass of Brander. Bruce would have seen this obvious strong defensive spot. This was an obvious ambush waiting to happen, and marching in there blindly would end in complete annihilation. So what did Bruce do? He marched in there blindly. On a decent morning, the mist normally lingers on the hills and rises as the sun heats the air up, and Bruce would use this to his advantage. James was the main man Bruce needed for the job he had in mind. James was tasked with taking a force with lightly armed men, mostly with bows, of the pass. They were to make their way along the heights till they were above the pass. From there they would ambush the ambushers when they were in bow shot range. Meanwhile, Bruce would march the main force straight into the path as if they were forcing their way through. The next morning, Bruce marched into the pass. It was so narrow that horses had to march in single file lines. John of Lorne was a pussy, so he chose to spectate the battle from a galley while his men did the dirty work. The battle then began by rolling boulders down to cause mayhem within the long drawn out column. The intention is to break morale in the formation and then to sweep in to destroy the Royal Army, but they never managed to get that far, as Bruce planned this battle to a T and had most of his nimble soldiers scrambling up the hill the moment the ambush began to engage the Lorne loyalists. At the same time, James had unconcealed his men and fired a volley of arrows into Lorne's men. Lorne's men realised they were post and outnumbered and tried to mount a defence, but when James's men dropped their bow and arrows and charged into them, it quickly fell and broke apart. The survivors fleeing to regroup towards the far end of the pass with the River Awe into Loch Etive. The pass crossed the bridge and the men tried to destroy the bridge, but Bruce's men didn't let that happen and quickly managed to charge over the bridge and cut down the defenders. When John of Lorne realised that he had lost, he fled back to England on his boat, and with that, Bruce took out another enemy and retaken another castle. After consolidating his position in Argyll, Bruce held a council at Ardchatton Priory on the north shore of Loch Etive. James would have been present and would have held a dominant position. As it is usual in times of war, advances were made in technology, and In James's personal group was a man called Sim of the Leadhouse, and Sim came to James with an invention he had made. It was a rope ladder. But wait, I bet you're saying, Lugs, the rope ladder has been a thing for centuries before. And yeah, you'd be right. And interrupting me is fucking rude. Shut up. Sim had invented a rope ladder with a large hook and 2 rings attached. One ring would be at the bottom with its wooden slats. The other would be stuck on the back at a right angle. This ring would be looped over a spear point. Since the Scottish loved their spears, this means it could be silently raised over a castle parapet. And as the first man began to climb the ladder, it would hook the ladder into place on the wall, making an even more solid grip, making it difficult for defenders to unhook the ladder. James was delighted with this invention and quickly informed Bruce of its uses. The Scots quickly began to employ this rope ladder right away, and it would climb over the walls of castles all around Scotland, with the English garrisons not knowing it until it was too late. The Scottish now could recapture castles without the need of siege engines, which was huge for Scotland since they were fucking poor as shit, had not a lot of resources left, and didn't have a lot of resources to commit to long and drawn out sieges of some of the best castles in Britain, like Roxburgh, Stirling and Edinburgh. With this new invention, James was feeling responsible for the south of Scotland, and since he had a mass amount of land there, so James set his eyes out on Roxburgh Castle, one of the most important and strongest castles in all of Scotland. It laid close to the English border, which meant it was easy to resupply, so he had to deal with it fast. Roxburgh was really just a walled town and a castle built on top of a large oval mound. It would be a hard task just to approach the castle, never mind be unseen. Never mind the 100-foot climb. So James had to use his brains for this. His plan to sneak up to the most defensible castle in Scotland was to crawl on his hands and knees, pretending to be a cow. So on the night of the 19th or 20th of February, James, accompanied by around 60 men, hid their horses and approached the castle. In the murky night, the men wore long black cloaks and got on their hands and knees and crawled in a single file line, pretending to be cattle. James's men definitely thought, what the fuck am I doing? But they were willing to do it, which says a lot about James and the trust that he actually had in his men. That a man on the wall actually shouted out to inform a farmer that his cattle were stray again, which mean the English believed they were cattle. I've got no proof for this claim, but I believe that James was moving while he crawled. Then the guards who were on the wall went back on patrol, which allowed James and his men to raise the rope ladder above the wall undetected. Then with a clink, the rope gripped the wall and Sim of the Leadhouse climbed up first, but a guard had heard the noise and ran to investigate. The English guard had reached the ladder as soon as Sim climbed over the top, but Sim drew out his dirk and grabbed the Englishman by the throat and stabbed him repeatedly before throwing him over the wall. And the Chad shouted down, saying that everything was all good. As the Scots waited their turn to climb up the wall, another English guard seen Sim, and instead of alerting the rest of the garrison, he went, fuck it, I'd win, runs at Sim. Sim just throws him off the edge, and a second Englishman hits the ground. They had stealthily made their way towards the main tower. The garrison, under the command of the knight Guilliman Defence, was celebrating Shrove Tuesday. They were drinking and dancing, then to the horror they had heard the words that had been given the English soldiers' PTSD for the past decade. Douglas, and James with his men stormed in and began slaughtering the English and capturing more. The garrison tried to make a defence, but they were quickly overrun and just destroyed. Defence managed to flee the hall and lock himself with a few men in a turret. The Scots were that brutal in their assault that some Englishmen preferred to jump off the wall and take their chances of surviving than fight the Scottish. The next morning, Defence realised the castle was lost, but he was a brave knight and refused to back down and held the turret. The Scots would fire arrows at the turret the moment they had seen movement, and one managed to hit Defence in the face. He feared that the wounds would kill him, so he surrendered on the term that his men and him could leave safely back to England, which James agreed to. Unfortunately, the French's wounds were too severe and he died on his way back to England. Sim was sent to inform Bruce of his siege of Roxburgh, and Bruce was delighted, rewarding Sim for his bravery in battle, most likely lands or riches. Then Edward Bruce was sent with some men to dismantle Roxburgh as part of the scorched earth policy to leave it useless to the English. Thomas Randolph, hearing the success of James in Roxburgh and wanted to one-up him, captured Edinburgh Castle using a similar strategy to James. Now, the capture of Edinburgh Castle deserves its own video in itself, but I'm making a Thomas Randolph documentary as well, so wait for that. If it doesn't happen, you'll just see a random Edinburgh Castle video, but yeah. With this, a healthy rivalry began to flourish between James and Randolph, trying to outdo each other in feats. The taking of the castles was going very smoothly, but there was one rare slip-up from Bruce. He had assigned Edward Bruce to siege Stirling Castle. From Lent 1313 till almost midsummer that same year, Edward Bruce was encamped at Stirling with his men, forming a circle around the wall, trying to starve the castle out. Edward Bruce, as I've described to you, is reckless and didn't have the same views of Bruce and James' avoidance of unnecessary risks. So he got bored and wanted to speed up the process of taking Stirling Castle. So Edward Bruce struck a deal with Sir Philip Mowbray, who was a Scot fighting on the English side, Kirk, who was in command of Stirling Castle. Edward made a pact that unless an English army came to within 3 miles of Stirling to fight for the relief of the castle before Midsummer's Day, 1314, Mowbray would hand it over to the Scots. This arrangement suited Mowbray as it meant the castle supplies could be rationed to ensure the garrison's survival no matter what, and he definitely knew the impact of the signing of this pact. Edward thought he was getting a better deal, of course. He would assume the English would just sit and wait for it to fall like the other castles, so he happily went back to Bruce to tell him the good news. Bruce, upon hearing this, could barely suppress his rage. Bruce knew this was basically a call to arms against King Edward II, and Bruce was right. England sent the call out all over Europe and as far as Constantinople to gather Gilles d'Argentan, who reckoned to be the third best knight in all of Europe. Letters went out to France, Gascony, Flanders and Brittany. Troops were summoned from Wales, Ireland, Hainault and Germany. Even the Scots, who supported England from the start, gathered to fight. Bruce rebuked his brother for his part in putting Scotland's future in jeopardy over him being bored of doing his job, but still the right mind to not cause division in Scotland, because they needed as much as they could get for this future battle. Bruce would have spies all over the border, keeping him posted of any movement by the English. Luckily for Bruce, King Edward II sent out summons to all his loyal Scots for footmen to gather at Wark-on-Tweed and cavalry at Berwick-upon-Tweed on the 10th of June. By mid-May, Bruce gathered his army at Torwood for training, with James training his own division. They had to drill the soldiers in new tactics designed to counteract the English heavy cavalry, and this was the Skiltron. The Skiltron involved spearmen formed into formations like a hedgehog, with the spears poking out at all angles. The Skiltron was basically a fortress of men, which was almost impossible to break their formation when training correctly. Although the formation's biggest weakness was archers, due to men being stationary and becoming huge targets, Bruce developed and improved the tactic. He would train his men to advance as one unit, keeping the impenetrable formation while being able to move. James had his own Skiltron of 1,500 to 2,000 men, which took the next few weeks to train. Bruce expected the English to travel through an old Roman road, running north towards Stirling and the River Forth. As Midsummer's Day drew close, Bruce drew his troops to the formation, back to the position he had chosen to wait for the English. The Scots faced the Roman road and arranged in 4 divisions. Bruce was closest to Torwood, and like the others contained somewhere between 1,500 to 2,000 men. Next in line was Edward Bruce's formation, with similar numbers. Then there was James's Skiltron. Nearest the village to St Ninians was Thomas Randolph's formation. Other than the 4 divisions, Bruce had 500 light cavalry under the command of Keith, the Marshal of Scotland, who had a special role in this battle. The English army, around 20,000 foot soldiers, not including the Irish contingent, and educated guesses put the amount of cavalry around 3,000 men. We are told this army, its workers and its baggage train stretched over 20 miles. The manpower ratio between the Scots and the English were 3-1 in this battle, and to add to that, the English had superior weaponry and armour. More men had come to the aid of the Scots, but Bruce wouldn't let them in the Skelton ranks since it would risk the formation. Instead, they were sent to rest in the camp atop of Gillies Hill. Bruce's scouts had reported the advance of the English army crossing the River Tweed, most likely on the 17th of June. The army halted briefly at Edinburgh on the 19th. We are told that it was urged to reach Stirling by the Dalrigh Agreement II by Edward. The troops marched 20 miles to Falkirk on the 22nd of June, making them only 15 miles from the Scottish army. When the English left Falkirk on the 23rd, Bruce sent James forward with Keith the Marshal to watch the English cross the flatlands between Falkirk and the Scottish position. James, by this point, was a well-experienced soldier and must have been nervous seeing the numbers approaching Bannockburn. James and Keith returned to Bruce, told him in private how the seemingly unstoppable army was on their doorstep, and Bruce told them to keep it to themselves to not cause panic. But also, this was actually true as well. A lot of dissent was building up in the English ranks about not getting the role in battle that they thought they deserved. Bruce had some of his forces out of the edge of Torwood digging potholes around 2 to 3 feet deep to break up the expected charge of the English cavalry, just like Loudoun Hill. He knew that there would only be 2 routes the English could have taken, either straight forward along the Roman road or down drop to the lower land near the River Forth and across the karst land there. The English army had passed Torwood Castle, and when they had reached the West Plain Farm, they sent 2 heavily armoured divisions of cavalry, one right down onto the land of the River Forth to head for Stirling Castle, its line making it too low for the main body of Scots to even notice. The other division going left, cutting through what was left of Torwood and directly for the Scots. Bruce was out with men helping them direct operations of digging the potholes when the 2nd English division burst through the trees. One of the English knights, called Henry de Bohun, saw Bruce's golden crown and wanted the glory of killing him. De Bohun lowered his helmet's visor and his lance and charged towards Bruce. Bruce was unprepared and was only on a small pony called a hobbin, and only was carrying his battle axe. With escape impossible in full view of the Scots, who must have been bricking it, Bruce drew his axe, and just when it looked like he was going to be impaled, he yanked the reins of the pony, reining it on its back legs. As the Bohun passed by, Bruce stood up in stirrups, raised his axe as high as he could, and swung it down as hard as he possibly could, crashing into de Bohun's head with such force that he cut through his helmet, chainmail, flesh and skull. The cut was so deep it went all the way to his breastbone. De Bohun's horse carried on for a few more steps before his body hit the ground. The only damage to Bruce was his axe, which he regretted due to it being his favourite battle axe. Just aura farming. Bruce fell back to the Scottish line where they pushed back the rest of the English. After this small skirmish, Bruce made his way back to the main body of the Scots, where his lieutenants, including James, were furious about Bruce gambling so much, and they were also astonished by what they just witnessed. As Bruce stood with James, Randolph, Edward Bruce and his lieutenants, they were all alerted that the other English division, which was out of sight, had been spotted nearby the village of St Ninians and were threatening to cut off the Scottish retreat. Bruce then saw Randolph, who was supposed to be guarding that area, and he pointed out that the English garrison, who he was meant to be blocking, was advancing, and was quoted in saying, "A rose has fallen from its chaplet," which apparently was a massive, diss back then. I don't even know what it means. Randolph then sprung into action, regrouping with his Skelton. The English division were led by Sir Robert Clifford and Sir Henry Beaumont. The English didn't expect to see the Scots marching out for battle, and they had around 600 cavalrymen under command, with some of the best armour and weaponry. Randolph, with only around 1,500 men on paper, wouldn't have looked like much of an obstacle for such a large body of heavy cavalry. Randolph's men dug in and pointed out their spears resembling a hedgehog, and within seconds, the English crashed into the Scots. The Scots were engulfed in a tidal wave of horses, and were hidden from the main body of Scots by the amount of dust that was in the air due to the initial crash. James was watching from cover with his Skelton next in line in case Randolph was broke or even was overrun. James had begged Bruce to let him march into battle to relieve pressure from Randolph, but Bruce wouldn't let him do this due to the main English body being nearby and couldn't risk losing any more men before the final assault. Eventually James couldn't contain himself and started to order his men forward, but as soon as they reached the edge of the cover, they could see a mound of dead men and horses around Randolph's Skelton, and that the English had taken to thrown their weapons and swords and axes and maces at the Scots out of frustration, being unable to break through. James, seeing this, didn't want to steal the glory from Randolph and ordered his men to halt. Randolph, sensing the English growing weaker, gave the order to advance, and the Scotsmen moved forward, forcing the English to break and flee. As Randolph's Scotsmen returned to the main body of Scots, it would have gave a huge morale boost for the defenders, knowing that the English were not invincible. Edward II would have gotten reports that both attempts to probe the Scots failed and resulted in heavy casualties, and would have been looking at the Scottish position and decided that their position was too strong for a frontal assault and too late in the day for further action, so he decided to lodge his army on low-lying boggy carse of the River Forth. The position was marshy, boggy, and the English had to take doors and woodwork from local houses to create makeshift bridges so that their horses could traverse the grounds. During the night of the 24th, Bruce was with James and the rest of his men discussing tomorrow's plans. Captains, when a rider from the English army arrived, it was Sir Alexander Seaton, a Scot who had been fighting for the English, and told Bruce that the English were demoralised and pledged his life that if he attacked the next day, he would defeat them. With this, Bruce asked his lieutenants, "Shall we fight or not?" And they all came to the unanimous decision for battle. Barbour tells us that they said, "We shall not fail for fear of death, nor flinching at any suffering till we have made our country free." That night, the English barely slept out of fear of waking up to an ambush or never waking up at all. When it began morning, Bruce called for quiet and delivered a speech that we have part of, and it goes as follows. "Those barons you can see before you, clad in mail, are bent upon destroying me and obliterating my kingdom, nay, our whole nation. We do not believe we can survive. Their glory and their warhorse and equipment. For us, the name of the Lord must be our hope of victory in battle." I tried really hard to find the whole speech, but it's been lost to time, and I couldn't find parts that were 100% accurate, or even, a part of it. There's been a lot of, poems about the speech, but not a lot are actually from the actual speech. Bruce then knighted more men with chivalry, stating that a battlefield was the best place to carry out such an honour. Barbour tells us that James was already knighted at this point, but there's some debate in this, and says he was knighted at Bannockburn. To me, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because he was in charge of knights before, and only really knights can command knights, or you know what I mean. So one theory says that James was promoted to a knight banneret at Bannockburn. This was an honour that can only be given on the field of battle, but it's just a theory. The Scottish army was in position and ready to march, and after Bruce gave the call, they began to advance. Edward Bruce's Scotsman was the first to move, then Randolph's, then James's. On the 23rd, Randolph was closer to St Ninians, but today they switched formations, so that's why it's different. Bruce had stationed his division behind the main bulk of the army, with his archers and light cavalry under Sir Robert Keith nearby him to able to command them more effectively. The English army began to move in position, with the English lords bickering on who should lead the battle to counter the Scots. Around 50 or so feet away, as two lines formed up, Bernard de Linton, the abbot of Arbroath, held up the brick bannock of St Columba. As it was lifted, the Scots dropped to their knees, reciting the Lord's Prayer and commending their souls to God. Edward II, seeing this, mocked the Scots' piety and believed that they were praying for his mercy. But in response to this, a Scottish knight fighting for the English, named Sir Ingram de Umfraville, said, "You are right, they ask for mercy, but not from you. They ask for God for their sins." The Scots rose, levelled their spears, and began to advance towards the English. As this happened, Bruce had sent his archers out to rush in front of the Scotsmen to harass the English archers, to draw attention away from his own footmen onto them instead. Refusing to delay the battle any longer, or to gain personal glory, the English heavy cavalry, under commander Sir Robert Clifford and Earl of Gloucester, began to charge to meet the advancing Scots, expecting to easily ride over the lightly armoured Scots. But the Scotsmen advanced forward. They were quickly closing the gap between the English, causing heavy cavalry to not be able to generate enough momentum to mount an effective charge. What also caused this disadvantage due to the heavy cavalry was the boggy terrain, which was also limiting the movement from the cavalry. This began to cause a huge problem for the English cavalry as the wall of Scottish spears got closer, so did the rear of the English footmen, leaving less and less room to be able to effectively engage the Scots. So basically, Scots were moving forward, the cavalry was moving forward, and behind them, the English were moving forward as well. The heavy cavalry smashed into the Scots, with Gloucester and Clifford being killed instantly by the wall of spears that came to meet them. Observers said that men would sink into the Scots like men falling into the ocean. Within minutes, the English cavalry was almost but destroyed. Finally, the English archers were ordered to fire into the Skeltrons. However, due to the ranks being so narrow, the English arrows flew over them. Due to this, they were ordered to fire directly at the Skeltrons. This caused a mass friendly fire disaster, as the cavalry was so tall they shielded the Skeltrons from any major volleys. The archers moved across the battle over the Pell Stream to get a more point blank shot in the side of the Skeltrons, but seeing this, Bruce immediately ordered Keith to charge light cavalry to disperse the English bowmen. The Scottish cavalry then overran the archers, causing mass casualties. When the English archers escaped back into the army, Keith began patrolling the Pell Stream to avoid any future movement from the archers. But that was the last movement from the archers. Not risking ending the battle in a stalemate, Bruce committed his own regiment into the battle, with them filling the gaps in Douglas's front lines. Seeing this, the men who were still in the Scottish camps, who weren't able to join the Skeltrons, also charged into the battle to aid the Scots. The English began to give more and more ground, and the Scottish victory was becoming more a matter of time rather than an if. With this, English commanders began to tell Edward II that he should retreat from battle, and Edward agreed, and the withdrawal of 500 knights was sent to protect the king's escape. But Sir Giles de Argentine, one of the best knights in Christendom, informed King Edward he wasn't used to fleeing a fight, so he reined his horse and charged into the Scots, and he was quickly impaled by a Scottish spear. Seeing their king flee from battle, the English ranks collapsed, and men started to flee from the battle. Many of them escaped over the gorge of the Bannockburn. Men stumbled over each other, with most men not even having faced a Scot yet. English chronicles recall the horrors that overcame their army. The Sala Chronica states that the English recoiled upon the ditch of Bannockburn, tumbling over another. The Life of Edward II states, while our people fled, a certain ditch entrapped many of them, and a great part of our army perished in it. In the end of the battle, out of the 20,000 Englishmen, 500 knights and men-at-arms were captured or killed, and up to 3,000 to 7,000 infantrymen were killed. The Scottish army, of around 5,000 men, only suffered 500 to 1,000 casualties. Bruce immediately called over James and told him about how King Edward II had escaped the battle and was most likely heading for Dunbar. So he was sent to chase after the English king with only 60 light horses. Chasing 500 heavily armed knights might be seen as a pointless and even suicidal task, but James, being James, didn't see it this way. He immediately shouted orders and quickly got men into pursuit. As they cleared Torwood, James came across Sir Lawrence of Aberney with 24 horsemen who were coming to fight for the English, but when they got informed on who won, they conveniently had a change of heart and switched sides for the Scots and joined James's group. Although fatigued from a long day of fighting and no sleeping, they continued the chase and managed to actually catch up with the English along the high road of Linlithgow at Witchborough. The English halted to let their horses to be fed, and seeing this, James ordered his men to do the same. The two sides would have definitely eyed each other down. It would be suicide to attack the English, as they were 10 to 1, but the English didn't dare to attack, as they were too demoralised and didn't want to be bogged down in another fight. As soon as the English set off, James followed in pursuit. He kept the Scots right on the heels of the English, killing and capturing any stragglers who had fallen behind. James was that close to the English that Barbour described as the English, in quote, could not stop for any slaughter to make. Some quote, by the way, in a weird way to say they couldn't shit. Also, to show how much the Scottish castle capturing campaign had done on the English, is heavily shown in Edward's retreat. Dunbar Castle was the safest and closest castle in English hands, which was 30 miles from the battle.
That's my job. That's my job. That's my job.